Hey honey, did Santa bring you a shiny new YouTube video?
Time for one last Patreon plug. For as little as $2, you can listen to Matt Orchard talking over videos you've already seen. And for a little extra, you get to see videos that will soon be free a little earlier than everyone else in YouTube town. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and most of all, enjoy the video!
On December 13th of 2001, Detective Art Holland received a phone call in his Durham, North Carolina office. The Christmas season was already panning out to be a busy one for him, as he had fallen into being the lead investigator in the case of Michael Peterson. Peterson, a high-profile novelist, stood accused of killing his wife Kathleen, who had been found at the bottom of a staircase in their house, banged up, bloodied, and very much dead. Michael was calling it an accident. Detective Holland and his colleagues were calling it murder, and now they were in the thick of trying to get all their ducks in a row to make sure that charge would stick once the matter made its way to trial. And boy, what a job that was panning out to be. This case was just bonkers. But Detective Holland still, quite literally perhaps, did not know the half of it until he picked up that phone. On the other end was a woman named Margaret Blair, and Margaret had just the story to make a man who's sure he's heard everything exclaim, "You have got to be kidding me." Margaret Blair had known Michael Peterson from years ago when he lived in Germany, and had recently learned of Kathleen's death through her niece, Margaret Ratliff. Margaret Ratliff and her sister Martha had been informally adopted by Michael and his ex-wife Patty following the untimely death of their widowed mother, Elizabeth Ratliff, sister of Margaret Blair. Margaret had of course been devastated to learn of Kathleen's passing, but in truth she hadn't really been able to fully process that part yet. She was still stuck on the death of her sister back in 1985, the fact that Michael Peterson had also been the last known person to see Elizabeth alive, and that Elizabeth had also been found battered and bloodied at the bottom of a staircase in her house. Now, coincidences do happen, and they don't magically stop happening when crimes occur. But certain criminal cases sometimes have a way of asking you, just how big and numerous can you possibly allow coincidences to be?
Durham 911, where's your emergency?
1810 Cedar Street, please.
What's wrong?
My wife had an accident. She's still breathing.
What kind of accident?
She's down on the stairs. She's still breathing. Please come.
Is she conscious?
What?
Is she conscious?
No, she's not conscious.
Okay. How many stairs did you fall down?
Huh?
How many stairs?
Stairs.
How many stairs? Calm down, sir. Calm down.
No, 15, 20, I don't know. Please, get somebody here right away, please.
Okay, somebody's dispatching the ambulance while I ask you questions.
It's in Forest Hills, okay? Please, please.
Okay, sir, somebody else is dispatching the ambulance. Okay, is she awake now? Hello? Hello?
Though there are a few things one could say about Michael Peterson's first 911 call, placed in the wee hours of December 9th at 2:40 a.m., the only thing to note right now is that he wanted the operator to know his wife Kathleen was still breathing. A short time later at 2:46 a.m., he called back.
911, where's your emergency?
Where are they? It's 1810 Cedar. She's not breathing. Please, would you hurry up?
Sir, calm down. They're on the way. Can you tell me for sure she's not breathing? Sir? Hello?
Another thing to note is that in both instances, it was Michael who terminated the call. But let's not pile on right out the gate, because in their totality, the 911 calls aren't exactly a perfect picture of fraudulence. Michael's concerns are squarely focused right where they should be, leading with the address that police need to get to, and stressing the urgency of their presence both times, while relaying the most important information about his wife's state, still breathing and then no longer breathing. And whether or not the shocked and bereaved husband thing is an act, subjectively speaking, he sounds the part well enough. Some contend in this moment he sounds inappropriately flippant.
How many stairs?
15, 20, I don't know.
But as much as it may sound off to some, it may strike others as being right on point. How many people are going to be in the mood to conduct a stair count while their wife is dying in front of their eyes? One curious omission from both calls, however, is the word blood, because that was one thing that immediately stood out to every first responder who arrived at 1810 Cedar Street that night. First on scene were paramedics James Rose and Ron Page. Knowing they were responding to an accidental fall case, they weren't anticipating much of a mess, a broken neck maybe in a worst-case scenario. When they walked in through the wide-open front doorway at 2:48, however, what they saw looked like something out of a horror movie. Kathleen Peterson lay face up, legs wide open, at the bottom of a stairwell adjacent to the kitchen. Michael was crouched over her sobbing, and the lower portion of the wall next to them was absolutely painted red. Michael was reportedly as inconsolable as he sounded in his 911 calls. The paramedics struggled to extract basic information from the man as he veered between excited rambling and shocked despondency.
At the time, the patient, as I said, we continued to ask the patient how long ago did she fall or whatnot. The defendant eventually told us that he just went outside to turn off the lights and he came back in and found her at the bottom of the steps.
Did he give you any other information about what had happened to Ms. Peterson?
No, sir.
Not that that information would have done any good. Kathleen's vitals were gone, and she had zero electrical activity in her heart. It would seem whatever it was that killed her had done so quite some time ago. No longer a medical emergency, the situation was handed over to police to investigate. Juanita McDowell and Victoria Fagora were the first officers on scene at 2:50 a.m.
Did you see others that were inside the dwelling? Other people?
Mr. Peterson and his son.
Okay. Do you recognize Mr. Peterson here in the courtroom?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you say his son. Do you know what his son's name is?
At the time, I did not know his name, but I learned it was Todd.
Okay. Do you recognize him in the courtroom?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Where is he seated?
On the first row.
Todd Peterson had technically been in the residence before even the paramedics, by a matter of seconds. According to Todd, he had pulled up arriving back from a Christmas party at exactly the same time the paramedics arrived and ran in through the open doorway ahead of them.
EMS personnel stated that she was deceased, and I looked in the room and saw a large amount of blood in there. So I had contacted communications on my radio and asked them to have CID and ID to contact me.
Why?
That's standard protocol when you see something that looks suspicious.
Well, what did you see that looked suspicious to you?
One, I had a deceased person there, and then there was a large amount of blood that, didn't look consistent with someone. That didn't look consistent with someone falling down steps.
Did you notice anything particular about the blood?
Yes, other than the fact that there was a lot of blood there, it also appeared to be dry blood.
What made you believe that it was dry blood?
It did not have the sheen that normally comes with wet blood.
Over the following minutes, more senior officers arrived, in addition to some of Todd's friends who were strangely allowed to stay, causing crowd control to become a bit of an issue. The friends were Heather Whitson, a doctor who Todd called to examine his father for shock, Ben Maynor, who was Heather's boyfriend and unhelpfully intoxicated at the time, and Christina Tomasetti, who Todd says was driving the car he had arrived in. Michael, Todd and Ben were sent out to the patio. After Heather was allowed to give Michael a look over, she and Christina were sent to Michael's study. The male and female groups were both instructed not to speak to one another so as not to influence independent accounts they may be asked for later. As the hour passed 4 and it got colder on the patio, the police mercifully allowed the 3 men into Michael's study and moved the woman to the living room. The strict no-talking policy remained in place. This policy, as well as the mounting police presence, was understandably beginning to irk Todd, who correctly discerned his father was under suspicion. Michael himself was being compliant, quietly surfing the web on his computer. At one point, he was heard muttering about a work email Kathleen had arranged to have sent to his account that same evening, as she did not have access to her work email from home.
She called me later in the evening around 11 p.m. I let her know there was a package that we would be reviewing of a document for that meeting and asked if she wanted me to email it to her.
What did she say?
She told me that she had not brought her laptop home with her. It was still at the office, so I asked her if she had a home email address that I could use. She said she did, but didn't know the address, and asked Michael. I asked somebody in the room, I assumed it was Michael, for his address and relayed it to me.
Was there anything abnormal about her tone of voice?
No, not to me.
Todd placed a discreet phone call to his uncle Bill Peterson to relay the situation and his concerns about the police. After taking a moment to recover from the bombshell news of Kathleen's fate, Bill Peterson told his nephew that his concerns were well placed and instructed him not to let Michael speak to police, which Todd firmly relayed to Michael. Detective Art Holland had been at the scene for a short time earlier, and suffice to say he had noticed all of the signs of foul play his colleagues had and then some. Now a little past 6 a.m, he was back with what the situation truly called for, a search warrant. Michael, Todd and company left the residence shortly after. With that distraction out of the picture, now investigators could really get to work. Detective Holland and ID tech Dan George conducted a videotaped walkthrough of the crime scene, starting from the walkway up to the entrance, where, surprisingly, they already began to make some curious findings. There was a droplet of blood on the bricks of the walkway, about 8 feet from the porch. Another droplet on the porch in front of a planter, a smear of blood on the door frame, and another smear of blood on the inside-facing part of the door itself a bit above the doorknob. Inside the house were bloody towels and paper towels around and under Kathleen, as well as Michael's tennis shoes and socks. According to Michael, he took them off not long after discovering Kathleen on account of the floor being slippery with blood. Plenty of blood in the stairwell, of course, and we'll talk in some detail about that later. But one thing to note right now is that just about all the carnage was limited to the lowest 5 steps. So if Kathleen had fallen, it would seem she hadn't come from the top, or even that close to it. Medical examiner Kenneth Snell soon arrived to provide a preliminary assessment of Kathleen's injuries. One of the first things he was able to observe were 2 lacerations on the back of her head that came together forming a V shape. Based on what he was seeing, Snell told officers that the edge of the steps couldn't be ruled out as the cause of the injuries, but if they wound up deciding evidence was pointing more toward a beating, they should be looking for a long, narrow rod of some kind as the murder weapon. A crowbar or a fire poker were the 2 things that came to his mind at that moment. He felt that further exploration of Kathleen's injuries on scene ran the risk of contaminating evidence and recommended they leave any further assessment till autopsy. At autopsy, it was found that Kathleen had at least 7 distinct lacerations on the back of her scalp. Several of those lacerations were deep enough that they cut right through to her skull, though her skull itself was not fractured, nor was there any bruising to her brain. 2 of the lacerations on the upper right side of her scalp were particularly curious in shape, forming what State's medical examiner Deborah Radish described as a tri-pronged pattern. Below those were 2 smaller horizontal lacerations, and to the left of her scalp were a collection of lacerations measuring from 2.5 to 5 inches in length, which when put together looked like 2 large vertical gashes intersecting toward the base of the skull. In her neck, it was found that Kathleen had a fracture and associated hemorrhage to her left thyroid cartilage, the sort of injury that would often be associated with strangulation. There was a 3 by 3 inch bruise on her left shoulder blade, and numerous small contusions and abrasions running down both hands and arms that were typical of defense injuries. Her toxicology was nothing to write home about. While it's not possible to say exactly how many drinks Kathleen had that night, with a blood alcohol level of 0.07% at time of autopsy, there is a high chance she was within the driving limit and basically no chance she was stumbling drunk at the time she died. There was Valium in her system, which she was prescribed and on occasion had been observed to take in conjunction with alcohol. We'll be coming back to these findings and what they've been argued to mean by various people as we get deeper into things. But before doing any of that, it's worth taking a step back for a moment and reflecting on the basics of this case. Like the bare bones basics. Putting aside the specifics of the injuries, tidbits throughout the crime scene the other lady from Germany police are going to find out about in a moment. Just at face value, what do we have here? Well, what we have is a wife found splayed out, dead on the floor, enough blood around her to make it look like a small bomb went off, and her husband saying, in so many words, she fell down some stairs. Regardless of whether or not you're already familiar with the sorts of things that are about to come, surely you would have to agree, at face value, this does have the hallmarks of a case that has absolutely no business being complicated. Bearing that in mind, it should come as no surprise that Michael Peterson was soon charged with Kathleen's murder. Subsequently, he hired the best criminal defense attorneys that money could buy, as one does, as well as inviting a crew of award-winning documentary filmmakers to embed themselves with his defense and family in the lead up to and throughout the entire trial, as one much less often does, but it made for one hell of a show. And perhaps one of the most useful moments from it comes right toward the start of the very first episode, where Michael provides his walkthrough of the night's events.
Kathleen and I were in here watching a movie, American Sweethearts. And I think it was probably around 11 o'clock that the movie ended. Went into the kitchen. We would talk for hours. Kathleen and I at nighttime would talk 2-3 hours, talk about the movie or the kids or what we were going to do. We probably had another bottle. I know we were drinking 2 bottles that night. And then what we would usually do on a nice night, we would go down to the pool, which I always, think is about the nicest place on the property. We were both right here. We were just talking and finishing our drinks. She said, I gotta go in. And the last I saw her was when I was there, and she was just, that's it. That was the last I saw Kathleen alive. No, she was alive when I found her, but barely.
So to recap the most important parts, according to Michael, he and Kathleen finished up the movie around 11 p.m. He understandably can't provide that many timestamps for their specific movements past that, but the only thing you really need to know is they went out to sit by the pool at the back of the property for some time before Kathleen went inside. One thing Michael didn't mention is that she was planning to log into his email account so she could read an after-hours work email. He corrects himself after saying this was the last time he saw her alive. She was still alive, just barely, when he found her at approximately 2:40 a.m. before making the 911 call, because, remember, according to him, she was still breathing at that time. Already we have a big problem for Michael's defense here. Kathleen appeared to have been dead for a while when paramedics got to her, which was only about 5 to 7 minutes after Michael stated to 911 that she was still breathing. We can say with confidence that Kathleen had been dead for a while, or at very least had been bleeding out for a while, because of the presence of red neurons in her brain. The way those come to show up is through a period of decreased blood flow to the brain over a period that may have been as long as 2 hours. So whatever it was that happened to her, she unfortunately did not die quickly from the injuries she sustained, bleeding out for some time. How much time exactly, we just can't say. Defense witness and neuropathologist Dr. Jan Leestmer gave an estimate of 45 minutes at the very lowest end before Kathleen stopped breathing. So let's go with that to give as much leeway to Michael as possible. This would put Kathleen heading inside at about 1:30 a.m., or significantly earlier, just not much later, because she needs time for her accident or what have you to happen and bleed out for that 45-minute minimum before Michael discovers her during her final breaths. Even giving him that minimum, it's all looking a bit tight. But whatever. Why is all of this a big problem for Michael? Well, do you remember this?
The defendant eventually told us that he had just went outside to turn off the lights and he came back in and found her at the bottom of the steps.
Just went out to turn off the lights, came back in and found her. Well, not only is that radically different from the story Michael just walked us through, it also would of course not give him anywhere near the minimum 45 minutes needed for his report of Kathleen still breathing to gel with those red neurons found in her brain. So either the EMS responder is lying, there was a very unfortunate misunderstanding, or Michael has altered his story to fit medical findings as well as he can. So what do the prosecution think happened?
The evidence is going to show that the Petersons had developed a huge appetite for expensive living. With Kathleen's salary and benefits during an 18-year career at Nortel, it was possible to cultivate a taste for fine things, and they certainly did that. There was plenty of money, and the potential of greater wealth at Nortel was always on the horizon. Kathleen was the primary financial support for the Peterson, Atwater, Ratliff family. They all depended on her for virtually everything. The evidence is also going to show that by the end of 1999, Michael Peterson was making no income as a writer, and that during the year of 2000 and 2001, he made no income as a writer and only had a modest income from a military pension. The evidence is going to show that Kathleen was carrying almost the entire financial burden for the family, and that it was overwhelming. The fortunes of Nortel had deteriorated, and as that happened, everyone at Nortel began to worry about whether they were going to have a job. This included Kathleen and everyone around her. There's going to be evidence that Nortel, because of its financial condition, had to lay off people, and Kathleen was involved in that process and was intimately aware of all that was involved in laying off people at Nortel because of Nortel's deteriorating financial condition. Kathleen and Michael both knew that the loss of Kathleen's job and the loss of her salary and benefits would have a devastating effect on an already difficult financial situation. But Mike Peterson, the creative thinker, the writer of fiction, was able to figure out the perfect solution. That solution was to make it appear as though Kathleen accidentally fell down her steps and died. And like magic, no more money problems. Like magic, Michael Peterson goes from a point where they're having to sell assets and live on credit to survive, all of a sudden, with her death, has $1.8 million in his hand. That's a lot of money. That solves a lot of problems. What a wonderful solution. There's only one catch. He's got to kill Kathleen Peterson to get that $1.8 million. The defendant says that Kathleen Peterson's death was caused by a tragic, accidental fall downstairs in their home. And we say, on the other hand, that she died a horrible, painful death at the hands of her husband, Michael Peterson. Kathleen's sister, Candace, gave several family members a blowpoke, just like this one, to several of the members of the family. She gave one to Kathleen. Kathleen had had this in her home for years and years and years and years. We will show you photographs where the blowpoke that's identical to this was in the home. But mysteriously, on December the 9th, it's gone. But understand, this is not the actual weapon. But we will contend to you that it is identical to what we say he used as part of the mechanism to cause these lacerations. We'll also say to you that she was forcefully impacted on several of the steps to cause some of this wound. But the primary mechanism is something like this. It's hollow, it's light, it's easily used, And we will contend to you this, or something like this. It's the article that was used to inflict these wounds. Some of this blood inside this stairwell is over 6 feet high. Outside the stairway, there's cast off that's 10 feet high. You will hear how the EMS folks say that the blood is so dry that we weren't picking it up off of our hands. We didn't get it on our shoes. We didn't get it on our clothes. The luminol testing showed that there were footprints into the washroom, footprints into the kitchen, and in various areas of the kitchen. Now, why is this important? As you're looking at these photographs, you're going to see things. And as we talk with you about it more and more, we will contend to you that this defendant was attempting to stage aspects of this scene so that it would appear as he wanted it to appear. He had to make it look right, but it didn't, and he made some mistakes, and we're going to point those out to you. Right after the house is released back to the Petersons on the 10th of December at about 8 o'clock, sometime after that, there's evidence that someone went into the computer, copied the entire hard drive, and then began selectively loading things back on the hard drive. Now, this is less than a day after her death.
And if you'll go as far as presuming it was Michael deleting all those files, the next question is, what sort of things might he want to hide? Lots of gay stuff, it turns out.
The evidence is going to show that he is bisexual and that he was having a relationship with a man outside of this county.
We both believe that after she had a phone call from a person that worked at Nortel about an upcoming trip that she was going to take, she discovered this information in the computer, which she would have been infuriated by learning that her husband, who she truly loved, was bisexual and having an extramarital relationship, not with another woman, but even with a man, which would be humiliating and embarrassing to her. An argument ensued, and the homicide occurred.
So to make a long story short, a trove of gay pornography and, more importantly, email communications aimed at setting up homosexual liaisons were found on Michael's computer, and the state were able to track down more than one man who could attest to being a party to such arrangements.
Said you had sex with him?
Oh, you're shitting me.
4 or 5 times?
Where?
I don't know all the details because I was skimming through all the stuff. And when I came to his...
You're kidding me. Jesus Christ.
But despite Michael's very convincing incredulity, he never denied his bisexuality, or indeed that he had sex with men while married to Kathleen, but with a major caveat, that Kathleen, at very least tacitly, was aware of it.
During your marriage, you had a number of affairs.
That's a word I've...
The word affairs is confusing to you?
Yes.
Well, let's make it simple then, sir. You had sex with other people after your relationship with Kathleen began.
That's correct.
Just men?
Yes.
How many different men did you have sex with after you started your relationship with Kathleen Peterson?
Maybe 6.
In fact, you never talked about that with Kathleen.
Well, we did talk about it.
That you were having sex with other men during the marriage?
In the sense that, yes, she understood that.
And you actually told her that?
It was simply understood again that in all the conversations that we'd have, all the jokings, every time we go to a military base, they're just like you. They're all gay. Look, they're all touching each other, patting each other all the time. I think that there was enough awareness on her part of me as a person and who I was.
So as you can see, the best even Michael can bring himself to is saying that Kathleen knew about and was very accepting of his bisexuality, and that from that it's probably safe to assume she was totally fine with him having actual homosexual intercourse outside of the marriage so he could get his fix, as it were. Let's imagine for a moment, just for argument's sake, you don't think that's safe to assume at all. Well, now you would have a solid theory for an instigating event. Kathleen goes to check her work email on Michael's email account, finds some of his communications and/or explicit imagery, and then furiously confronts him. Perhaps he decides to kill her right there and then, Or maybe, during some pushing and shoving, Michael goes too far and seriously hurts Kathleen, at which point he decides he has to go the whole way and stage it to look like a fall down the stairs. It's better to be in trouble for domestic assault rather than murder, but better still to be in no trouble at all on account of an accident. When you think about it like that, you don't actually need the financial problems in Kathleen's life insurance policy. Totally up to you whether that factored into the motive or not. And one thing you always have to bear in mind with cases like this is that the prosecution just have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime. They aren't actually duty-bound to demonstrate a motive, though it often helps. In a similar vein, they also aren't duty-bound to demonstrate the defendant's propensity to murder, though that also often helps. Which brings us back to Margaret Blair and her very helpful tip about Elizabeth Ratliff and her eerily similar fate some 16-odd years prior to Kathleen's demise. Michael and his then-wife Patty Peterson had come to know Liz and her husband George Ratliff by way of Patty and Liz both working as teachers at the Rhine-Main Air Base School in Frankfurt, Germany during the 1980s. George Ratliff died in 1983 during a secret military operation, the precise circumstances of which are actually mysterious as well, though no credible theories of Michael's involvement in that have ever come to light. Patty and Michael stayed close to Liz and her two small daughters Margaret and Martha in the years that followed, and in fact the three were dining together on the evening of November 24th, 1985, the night before tragedy would strike again. At the conclusion of the evening, Mike offered to walk Liz home, a kind gesture and no sort of hassle given Liz lived only a few doors down from the Petersons. According to Mike, Liz made it home without incident. But the following morning, Liz Ratliff's nanny, Barbara Malagnino, made a horrifying discovery.
I went up to the door and then I realized that all the lights were on in the house.
So after you actually put the key in the door and opened the door, what happened next?
I see all the lights are on, and I see this body lying there.
When you say this body, what do you mean?
There was I didn't recognize it as being Liz to begin with.
Now, why is that?
I don't know. I just didn't recognize it. I thought something else had happened.
What did you do?
I shouted her name a few times, and I ran up the stairs.
Did you shout her name thinking that she was going to be upstairs?
Yes, that something had happened upstairs.
What next happened?
Then I ran upstairs and I see that she's not there. Then I took the telephone from out there.
Now, where was the phone?
It was in her bedroom.
And was that the normal place it would have been?
In the evening, she took it always to bed with her, yes.
What next did you do?
I put it on the stairs and I tried to phone the Peterson family.
What happened when you tried to phone them?
Our telephone was dead.
What happened next?
I ran back down the stairs again, and then when I got to the bottom of the stairs nearly, I see that these boots in the feet was Liz. That the body was Liz that was on the stairs.
Could you tell what other type of apparel she had on?
I remember she had I think it was a red pullover on, but I can't be sure. I have recollection that she had a red pullover on.
A red pullover?
Well, I thought it was a red pullover.
Like
if it was a red pullover because it was a red pullover or because everything else was red, I don't know.
Did you see blood?
Oh, yes.
Where did you see blood?
All the stairway up, the stairway, there was blood. Liz was lying in a pool of blood.
Did you see any blood on her, the front part of her? Or do you remember whether she was face up or face down?
She was face up. Then I ran outside and told the taxi driver he had to get an ambulance and the police.
All right, what happened next?
Then I went in and I felt her body.
Mm-hmm. What part of her body did you feel?
Here.
What next did you do?
I ran over to the Peterson house.
All right, what did you do when you got to the Petersons?
I banged the door, the front door.
And who answered?
Patty came to the door.
What happened?
I told Patty that something terrible had happened. They have to come to get Mike.
Did you see Michael Peterson at that time?
As I was talking to Patty, he came to the top of the stairs. And Michael came running over with me. Michael came in and Patty was also there. I can recollect thinking they are coming also there. And I ran up the stairs again to see if the babies were okay.
And when you went up there, what did you find concerning the children?
The babies were still asleep.
So what did you do?
I wanted to go in the toilet and vomit. I was in the toilet, and Michael came upstairs, and he's telling me to get a sheet, to get a blanket. And I says, why? And he says he wanted to cover Liz up. And he said she was dead. And I says, no, I felt her. She's warm. And he says, she's not warm, Barbara. And he took me by the arms, and he says, she's not warm, she's dead. The warmth comes from the floor heating.
Now, while you were there, did any investigators or authorities come?
The German police came at the very beginning.
How many?
Oh, I don't remember. I think 2.
Did they interview you?
No.
Did you see any authorities interviewing anyone, or did any of you all talk to the authorities?
Michael was speaking with the authorities. He was telling them that there had been an accident and that we were an American family and it had already been reported on base.
So any conversation you had with him about what happened, what was his explanation of how Ms. Ratliff died?
He had came in later in the same day that she died, and he said that she had a cerebral hemorrhage and that she had fallen down the stairs. But she was dead before she hit the stairs. I think that was to quieten us all down. And I says, no, I don't believe it. And apparently an autopsy was going to be...
Objection going beyond the question that was answered. Ask overruled.
You may answer.
I've lost the thread now.
Do you remember what you were saying?
Yes, there was going to be an autopsy be done. There was going to be another autopsy done.
And naturally, an autopsy was done. The medical examiner in Germany found that Liz Ratliff had indeed died of a stroke, presumably after which she had fallen down the stairs, leading to further post-mortem injuries. Fast forward all those years later, however, and authorities in Durham felt they had cause to be skeptical of that finding, in light of the strikingly similar manner in which Kathleen Peterson had been found dead. With the permission of Margaret and Martha Ratliff, who to this day have always stood by the man who took them in following their mother's passing, Liz Ratliff's body was exhumed for a second autopsy by Durham's medical examiner of choice.
They could have had that autopsy done in Texas. Instead, what the prosecutors did was they spent thousands of dollars in order to allow Deborah Radish, who had already concluded that Kathleen Peterson's death was not accidental, to perform the autopsy on Elizabeth Ratliff.
Whatever you may think of the prospects of Michael's innocence in either case, you may agree with David Rudolph that it does at least look like a bit of a slanted approach to truth-seeking. Regardless of whether or not there was anything corrupt about it, the defence's concerns that Radish may come to less favourable conclusions about the nature of Liz Ratliff's passing than the German medical examiners did in fact turn out to be warranted.
The pathologist who did this report was also very vague about where the hemorrhage in the brain was, or around the brain. He calls it intracranial hemorrhage. That's a pretty non-specific term. It just means that there's bleeding somewhere inside the skull. There are certain compartments around the brain where blood can accumulate depending on where the injury occurred. And it's pretty basic. It's basic medical student knowledge to know what those compartments are and to be as descriptive as possible in describing exactly which compartment in or around the brain the blood is found. And I'm still not clear exactly where he found the blood in this case.
Now, with respect to the examination that you conducted of Ms. Ratliff, do you have an opinion as to her cause of death?
Yes, I do.
What is that opinion?
In my opinion, the cause of death of Mrs. Ratliff was blunt trauma of the head.
With respect to the cause of death, do you also have an opinion as to the manner of Ms. Ratliff's death?
Yes.
What is the manner of death, in your opinion?
In my opinion...
Overruled.
In my opinion, the manner of death in Mrs. Ratliff's case was homicide. Both have injuries on their faces, and if you remember on Mrs. Peterson's, her injury was of the right eyelid, and Mrs. Ratliff's was actually in the left eyelid. In addition, there's a laceration over Mrs. Ratliff's eyebrow on the left. We do have some bruising on the back of Mrs. Ratliff's left wrist and hand, and we saw similar type of bruising on the backs of both Mrs. Peterson's forearms and hands. And most notably are the numerous scalp lacerations that each one of these women sustained.
And with respect to the planes of each of their heads, as it relates to the location of the lacerations, what similarities exist?
Well, what's striking about Mrs. Peterson's injuries are that we have them, even though they're predominantly on the back of the head, they're on the back and the sides. They're going up kind of over the brim line. They're generally horizontal, vertical, but then we have a couple of horizontal ones as well. The thing that's interesting about Mrs. Ratliff's injuries is also that they're on the back of the head, but she has 7 lacerations in 5 different areas of her head. She has one on the top of her head, 3 on the right back, one on the left back, one on the left side, and then one actually on her forehead. So we're seeing multiple severe lacerations in both cases, in different planes, going different directions, with different presenting sides of the head.
Let's talk a little bit about the autopsies that were done in Germany, if we could. You know that Dr. Barnes did the initial autopsy.
Yes.
And did you know that he was board certified in anatomical pathology?
I didn't know that when I reviewed his autopsy. No.
When did you find that out?
I think after his testimony.
And how did you find it out?
I just asked.
And you know, do you not, that at the autopsy that he conducted in Germany, he saw evidence of an area of tissue destruction at the cerebellar brainstem junction. You're aware of that, are you not?
That's what he described, yes.
He also noted in the report that blood filled all of the ventricles of the brain, did he not?
That's what the report says, yes.
That would be consistent with what's called an intraventricular hemorrhage, would it not?
Yes.
Are you aware that in addition to it being in his report, he testified here under oath before this jury that he saw blood in all the ventricles with his own eyes?
I just know what his report says.
You saw no evidence of that in 2003.
That's correct.
But of course, blood in the ventricles is something, when an autopsy is being done fresh, it's either something you see or you don't see, right?
Well, yes, once the brain is cut.
Right.
Right.
Someone who's board certified in anatomic pathology would be capable of recognizing blood filling all the ventricles of the brain, would they not?
I would expect so, yes.
Were you aware that various witnesses, including a witness who testified here, reported that Elizabeth Ratliff had a headache 3 days before she died that was so severe that she had actually made a doctor's appointment for the following week?
The information I had came from the autopsy report, which was complained of severe headache for previous 2 weeks.
Okay. And blood in the ventricles can be, not necessarily is, but it can be indicative of a non-traumatic stroke from a ruptured vascular anomaly, can it not?
Yes, it can be.
And such a hemorrhage, stroke, could cause tissue destruction, could it not?
It could.
You agree with them that she died of an intracranial hemorrhage in 1985, correct?
I believe that was most likely part of the mechanism of her death, yes.
The disagreement that you have is not over whether there was an intracranial hemorrhage, it's over whether it was spontaneous due to a vascular malformation or a stroke, or whether it was due to blunt trauma, right?
That's correct.
Rigor mortis, or rigor mortis, is something that medical examiners use to at least get an estimate of time of death, right?
Yes, generally a rough estimate.
And it develops pretty much over about a 12-hour period, give or take some time.
Yes.
So, for example, if someone died at 11 p.m. or thereabouts, one would expect by 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock the next morning, certainly by 11 o'clock the next morning, to see some significant rigor, right?
Yes.
And do you know whether or not anyone who was with Elizabeth Ratliff's body that morning from 8 a.m. till, say, 12 noon when her body was moved into the next room, do you know whether anyone reported any kind of rigor?
No, I don't know if anyone made that observation.
A full accounting of medical arguments relating to Liz Ratliff's death and whether her overall state comported more with a blunt force homicide or a stroke followed by post-mortem injuries during a subsequent fall could make up its own video. It is, after all, a case within a case. To make a long story short, medical opinions differ. And the ultimate question you as a layman have to grapple with is the very same as was posed from the outset. Could it really just be a coincidence? The argument against that conclusion is quite self-evident. So as a way of transitioning into the overall defense side of things, let's start building an affirmative argument for it. It was mentioned a while ago that the prosecution only has the burden of proving the crime was committed. They don't have to demonstrate a motive, but it often helps. And when it most helps is when they haven't proven the crime was committed. A bar would contend they've fallen well short of in this instance. So if Michael did kill Liz Ratliff, and there's somehow a connection between that and the murder of Kathleen, well, why did he do that, and what on earth would the connection be?
He's found a way to kill women 17 years apart, right? I mean, this is like in the mid-'80s. So he strikes like every 17 years by finding some way to kill women on a stairway. Is that the...
Right.
When put like that, it sounds every bit as far-fetched as just a coincidence, really, doesn't it? But of course, dastardly staircase killer isn't the only potential motive. Some have postulated a financial motive by way of taking the girls in to receive George's military pension, as well as what remained of the Ratliff estate. But then raising two small girls all the way to adulthood, including putting them through college, would inevitably lead to more outgoings than incomings as far as that's concerned. So what if the motive wasn't money, but simply assuming guardianship of Margaret and Martha? Why would Michael go to such lengths to do that? There's an interesting little story within the case on this. When the Peterson family were first thrust into the public eye, many of those eyes found their way from gazing upon the face of Michael Peterson over to that of Margaret Ratliff. To many observers, she struck quite the resemblance to her supposedly adoptive father. The distinctive Roman nose, and even how closely their eyes were placed to its ridge. The brows above their eyes also appeared a similar, somewhat shorter than average length. Even their mouth shapes seemed to resemble each other. The prosecution was certainly intrigued by the possibility that Margaret at least may have been the result of a secret affair between Michael Peterson and Liz Ratliff, and that such reality could be a part of the explanation as to what would drive Michael to murder the poor girl's mother, so he could take back what was rightfully his before returning to live in America. And one day, they were delivered an opportunity to test the theory. The DA's office received a letter from Margaret angrily demanding the payment of blockbuster late fees. They had been incurred as a result of the state continuing to hold the rented copy of America's Sweethearts in evidence. No word on how that matter was resolved, but they did manage to swab Margaret's DNA in the form of saliva from the envelope, which they then sent away for testing against samples they had on file for Michael. And when those results came back, no biological relation. The uncanny resemblance between the orphan child of an allegedly murdered mother and the murder accused who had taken custody of her was, it would appear, just a coincidence. And that isn't even the only example of a seemingly promising connection failing to pan out in this case. How's this for an eerie one?
Now, you've never been inside 1810 Cedar Street, is that correct?
No.
Do you recognize anything on this photograph that's familiar to you?
This cat here is...
The cat picture?
Mm-hmm.
How do you recognize the cat picture?
This cat picture was hanging in my room when I was living in Grafenhausen.
The cat picture is a print of an 1896 painting titled The Black Cat, and its ominous presence hovering over the blood-soaked site of Kathleen Peterson's death has become a sort of iconic feature of the case for its followers. And it's all the more ominous still in light of the revelation that the very same picture, though confirmed to be a different print, was also hanging in the house of Liz Ratliff. By some accounts, it even hung at the bottom of the staircase, though as you just heard from Barbara Malagnino, she recalls it residing in the bedroom she would sometimes sleep in. Regardless of where it was placed though, how could such a specific painting's presence at two remarkably similar alleged to be crime scenes, sharing the same alleged perpetrator, be nothing more than happenstance? But just as with Liz and Kathleen's deaths in the main, the notion that there is a connection between the two Black Cat paintings would seem to be at least as fanciful as the notion that there is no connection at all. Are we supposed to believe that Kathleen's murder was so fiendishly premeditated that Michael adorned the wall of her planned murder site with an artistic tribute to another of his wicked crimes months, maybe years in advance? Some have theorized instead that perhaps just before going through with murdering Kathleen, Michael saw the Black Cat and was maybe even subconsciously reminded of how he successfully passed Liz's death off as a fool all those years ago. Not disprovable, but if you're going to be open-minded enough to entertain a connection as far-fetched as that, it seems only fair to keep an explanation as far-fetched as no connection at all on the table as well. And perhaps no explanation for the Black Cat is as eerie as that one. How very, very strange it is to have a case with a central question of, can you write things off as a giant coincidence, where the woman at the center of everything lies dead beneath a painting that almost seems as if it was placed there to remind you, giant coincidences can happen. One thing's quite safe to say. Whether or not you think Kathleen and Liz's deaths are connected will largely hedge on whether or not you think Michael did in fact murder Kathleen to begin with. So let's get back to the main event.
Would it be fair to say that in cases involving beatings with blunt objects, where someone is really trying to kill somebody, that there are certain injuries that one generally tends to see? Head injuries in particular. Do you have any idea how much force this would generate in a situation where somebody was beating somebody with it?
Well, that would be variable.
In terms of the kinds of injuries that one would generally see as a medical examiner in a beating case with a fire poker, death, you would often see, would you not, fractured skulls?
If you're talking about what we talked about yesterday with a fire poker, the kind that I might have, solid, heavy metal cast iron, with a heavier instrument like that, you would expect with, if the similar force were applied, that it would be more likely to cause a skull fracture. That's not absolute, though.
So is it your testimony that the weight and heft of this would not cause a skull fracture if someone
hit somebody over the head with it? Even a linear skull fracture?
I think it may or may not. Again, there's not a force. There may be a certain force that's high enough or in a particular area of the skull that's not as thick where it would be more likely to cause a fracture, but it wouldn't necessarily have to.
Do you know what percentage of the 257 cases in North Carolina from 1991 to 2003 had skull fractures?
You know, I don't.
How about fractures of the facial bones? You know, sometimes if somebody's getting beaten about the head, they may get an orbital fracture around their eyes or a fracture of their jaw, right?
Yes.
Brain contusions.
That depends on a variety of fractures, but they're often seen.
And same thing with edema or swelling of the brain.
Yes.
If someone survives for an hour or 2 hours, one might very well see some swelling or some contusions, right?
You may, yes.
And of course, Kathleen Peterson didn't have any skull fracture.
No, she didn't.
Or any contusion on the brain.
No.
Approach. I want to just put these up here, and obviously you're not going to be able to read these all, but I want you to just tell me if they appear to you to be, just from looking at them, a collection of all the autopsies involving blunt trauma to the head for that time frame.
I don't really think I can give you an accurate answer to your question.
All right.
Not today.
All right. Well, when you came to your opinion in this case, were you aware that in every single beating case from 1991 to 2003, where there were multiple impacts to the head, there were either fractured bones or extensive brain injuries or both?
No, I don't have a way of knowing that unless I looked at them.
David Rudolph has sometimes been accused of being theatrical in the way he conducts his defense. But here we see an example of how such an approach can serve to put special emphasis on a very important point. It is true that Kathleen Peterson had no fractures to her skull, no bruising of her brain, and no swelling of the brain either. Deborah Radish was careful not to speak in absolutes, which is prudent. There are indeed a variety of factors that will dictate whether or not a skull fracture or other specific injuries will occur during a head beating. One reason the prosecution liked the idea of the blowpoke was its hollowness, allowing the user to blow air into a fire with it. The idea was that the hollow interior would allow energy to be distributed more evenly through the weapon at the contact point of a strike, and subsequently lower the odds of a skull fracture. So a better candidate than a crowbar or a baseball bat, say, and that's better than nothing. But is the theory actually good? I.e., putting aside absolute assertions like impossible, should you take it as remotely likely that Kathleen would incur no skull fractures or brain contusions if Michael were to beat her around the head with that blowpoke in the manner the prosecution theorize? To consider this, rather than get bogged down in hours of conflicting and complicated medical opinions, it might be more instructive to go back to basics for a moment and consider only that which can be observed with the naked eye, and then put that against simple intuition. Look at all of this blood on the north wall of the stairwell. How much of it there is, how dense it is toward the bottom, how high it goes, how many droplets there are spraying outward, in excess of 10,000 individual spatters. Now think about blunt force. Earlier in the video, we described the scene as looking like a small bomb went off. Now whether or not that description is perfect, hopefully you'll agree it's more reflective of the scene than what comes to mind when thinking about blunt force. When someone is hit in the head by a blunt instrument, hollow or otherwise, it will sometimes not draw any blood at all, because it's blunt. Other times, however, it'll draw some blood, sometimes even a lot. Like Dr. Radish said, there are a variety of factors to consider. Chiefly among those factors is force. The harder you hit, the more blood you're likely to get. And of course, there's the question of how many strikes. Kathleen's head injuries were numerous, but of course still finite. There's a cap to how many strikes you can reasonably theorize. The state set a minimum of 7 and a maximum of 10, so we'll go with 10. How intuitive does it feel to you that 10 strikes with a blunt instrument would create this high, wide, explosive type of spatter on the wall? Again, trying to stay away from categorical words like impossible, you'll hopefully agree that should such an outcome be possible, the key variable again would be force. If you could create a pattern like this by hitting someone in the head 10 times with a blunt instrument, you would have to hit them really, really hard. But then if you hit someone in the head with a blunt instrument, hollow or otherwise, and you hit them really, really hard, 10 separate times, how likely could it be that you would not crack their skull once, or bruise their brain? It really isn't a trivial problem, but the bad news for the defense was poking holes in the prosecution's case wouldn't be enough with the amount of evidence that was still stacked against Michael. They would need to present some kind of alternative explanation for how Kathleen and the stairwell around her came to look the way they did without any foul play on his part. While making it clear that the precise circumstances behind how each and every single one of Kathleen's injuries came about was unknowable, the defense's rough approximation of what happened to her that night was as follows. With as much as 3 glasses of wine and a Valium in her system, Kathleen made her way up the dimly lit stairwell, but did not get far. Slipping on the 5th step, she fell back and banged her head on the moulding of the doorway. This incurred a serious laceration to the back of her head and knocked her out. She also incurred other minor injuries to places such as her arms as she fell down, and a smaller laceration or two near the base of her skull when her head landed on one of the lower steps. She stayed unconscious for a time, as she bled both internally and externally. Eventually she woke up. Blood had now pooled around her and gotten on the bottom of her feet. Panicked and dazed, she attempted to get up, but slipped around in her own blood. She further bloodied up the north wall as she struggled to balance herself on it, coughing up more blood spray around the same time. Tripping again, she sustained further injuries to her head, either from knocking it on the stairs again, the railing of the stairwell, or both. She was unable to regain enough balance and strength from this point to find her way to help. She stayed splayed out at the bottom of the stairwell, bleeding and dying, until Michael finally came in from outside, discovering her as she took her very last breaths.
My wife had an accident. She's still breathing.
What kind of accident?
Down on the stairs. She's still breathing. Please,
Is she conscious?
While the defense's explanation may be less intuitive than the prosecution's, it at least provides a scenario wherein Kathleen could have sustained her head lacerations without a skull fracture or brain bruising, on account of lower impact velocity than a bludgeoning. It also posits an explanation as to how all of that blood could have been spread on the wall without any head impacts from the blowpoke. Speaking of that blowpoke, the defense scored a bit of a coup on that front toward the end of the trial.
You are the lead detective in this particular matter, are you not?
Yes, sir.
And you have been so since December 9th of 2001, I believe.
Yes, sir.
Have you all given any thought, you personally, have you given any thought to what would happen? This is a pretty light item, isn't it?
It's fairly light, yes, sir.
Hollow?
Hollow.
Flexible. Have you given any thought to what would happen to an item like this if someone hit somebody over the head 3, 4, 5 times hard enough to cause the lacerations on the scalp?
Probably mangled up.
You heard Mr. Harden ask Clyde Anderson yesterday whether it was possible that a blowpoker like that was in the house somewhere and that he just hadn't seen it. Remember that?
Yes.
Did you just assume that it was gone?
Gone or put up somewhere.
show you what's been marked Defendant's Exhibit 280. See that?
Yes, sir.
Now, this 280, that's a blowpoke, isn't it? Is that what it appears to be?
Appears to be a blowpoke.
If we look at the handle, for example, it's pretty much the same thing, isn't it? See this end here you blow into?
Oh, sure. Just looking at the... Appears to be.
Do you know where Defendant's Exhibit 280 has been for the last 20 months or longer?
No, I don't.
This doesn't appear to you to be mangled, does it?
It's not mangled, no, sir.
It's not even dented, is it? See any dents in there? Even like a tiny little indentation?
Doesn't appear to have any dents in it.
Does this appear to you, 280, to be the blowpoke that Mr. Harden has been talking about being mysteriously missing since this trial began?
Objection to the characterization.
Sustained.
The blowpoke had supposedly been discovered in the Petersons' garage by Michael's son Clayton the day before Detective Holland was called to the stand. We say supposedly because the extremely convenient discovery understandably raised many eyebrows at the time. Could the defense have staged this as a last-minute Hail Mary? It has since come to light, however, that the blowpoke had been noted and photographed by police in the very same place during a search in June of 2002, over a year before Clayton Peterson's discovery. Why exactly the police finding in June never made its way to Michael's defense team will be left to you to decide, but it would seem shocking incompetence or brazen corruption are your only two real options. In any event, as David Rudolph noted, the blowpoke was not warped or dented in any way, which is to say it was not the murder weapon. And while the prosecution would object, they had always maintained the blowpoke, or something like it, was the murder weapon. They'd never gone as far as to give alternative examples of what sort of long, cylindrical, hollow, metal instruments that something like it might be. It was a very niche hypothesis, and as such, a reasonable person could well infer the state's case was blowpoke or bust. In the end, however,
we, the 12 members of the jury, unanimously find the defendant to be guilty of first-degree murder. This the 10th day of October 2003, signed by 4 persons. Is this your verdict, so say you all? Yes.
Reasonable doubt, and what exactly qualifies as it, is an interesting question in cases like this. The case against Michael Peterson, as presented by the state of North Carolina, absolutely did have not at all superficial flaws, and some would argue demonstrating as much should be taken as crossing that reasonable doubt threshold, as it is after all the state that has the burden of making everything come together. Even if they're right for the wrong reasons, it shouldn't be on the defendant's head if the state fails to show up with the correct theory. The other way of looking at things is that finding justice for the victim should be weighed about as heavily as anything, and that in a situation such as this, where there is certainly a victim, and she certainly was battered and bloodied in a house where no one else but Michael resided, even if the state does fail to explain precisely how she came to be that way, because she is that way, there is indeed some burden on the defense to explain how that could have come to be, other than at the hands of Michael. And their full theory simply wasn't close to good enough on that count. As if Kathleen sustaining her minimum of 7 head lacerations and all other cuts and scrapes across her body via 2 falls beginning no higher than the 5th step was not convoluted enough, there was also the question of her crushed thyroid, an injury noted earlier in the video as being consistent with strangulation. Not proof of strangulation, mind you, and there was a lack of associated bruising in the area you would typically anticipate to be present in such an event, but all the same. For the defense to clean that up, they would need Kathleen to make an unusually precise fall neck first onto one of the steps, in addition to making all the tumbles necessary to get the various gashes in her head. On top of that, bear in mind that as one tumbles downstairs, they lose velocity at each step. In short, the notion of her keeping up enough of a pace to cut her head open that many times just strains credulity. And the defence's proposition that the north wall was so badly bloodied, in part because of Kathleen coughing up blood on it, basically hedged on the jury not paying attention. It was testified to on numerous occasions that she had no blood in her airway. What it all boils down to is, sometimes when a murder takes place, if you weren't there, it may prove to be nearly impossible to demonstrate how everything came to be the way it was by the time the murderer felt comfortable calling police to the scene. Hopefully you'll get most of it down more or less perfect, but just one faulty premise can always lead to a slight wrong turn in your case, which then muddies the whole picture up and just confuses the hell out of everyone. If the fundamentals are still there though, hopefully it won't confuse them enough to make them forget the big picture. The big picture in this case being, insofar as aspects of Kathleen's injuries and the scene around her did not appear to be perfectly compatible with a bludgeoning, they were twofold incompatible with an accident. And if her death wasn't an accident, then it was a murder. And if it was a murder, then Michael Peterson was guilty of committing it beyond a reasonable doubt. Because after all, if not Michael Peterson, then who? Now comes the part of the video that some of you will have been waiting for, and others will have had absolutely no way of ever anticipating. It's the part where we will be weighing the evidence for and against the notion that an owl swooped down and attacked Kathleen Peterson that night, setting things in motion for how everything came to look the way it did and leaving poor Michael holding the bag. It's quite an eccentric theory, to put it mildly, so before walking you through its specifics step by step, it's worth addressing a few foundational questions you may be asking yourself. Foundational question 1. Could an owl have had an opportunity to attack Kathleen that night? Potentially, yes. There are several species of owl native to the area, and in fact there's a scene in the staircase where Michael's defense team are establishing Kathleen's screams from inside the home after her supposed fall would not have been audible from the back of the property. They established that point quite convincingly. Not a whisper from the full blast stereo makes its way to the back. But you can hear this. Foundational question 2. Do owls attack people? Oh yes. While we often depict the species in a friendly, peaceful light in numerous fictional works and selective nature photography, don't be sucked in by the propaganda. For as much as we may seem to like owls, owls have made it abundantly clear over the years that they do not care for us at all.
Owls attacking people.
Yeah, it's happening in Bush's Pasture Park in Salem.
All of a sudden, my cap was sucked off like a vortex, and it was like a tearing, shearing sensation. A really sharp object on the top of my head.
Startling attack without warning, an owl targeting a woman during her morning run.
Neighbors call it an air attack. An owl is swooping down on residents in Clayton.
Painful. Now the bird striking her in the head at least 3 times. Neighbors have even written a warning on the sidewalk. Beware of owl close by. Warning.
It was definitely aggressive.
It has relied on humans for food.
The second I turned around, I saw my shadow, didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. It just took me to my knees. I didn't really think of an owl thinking someone hit me until I felt the back of my head. I literally can't think of anything I could have done to provoke it.
A police officer in Louisiana crashes his patrol car on Christmas Eve after being attacked. The perp had wings and talons.
Suddenly I felt something hit the left side of my face, so I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's a football or something. And then I felt some scratching on the back of my head and some pecking.
That's right, an owl flew right into his open driver's side window.
Yeah, I bet he got a hoot out of that.
The Brookwood Hills neighbourhood is on high alert as the result of one particular barred owl that has attacked people multiple times.
I felt something just come down and just grab me on the head.
We were up to about 40 incidents, but I think that those 40 people
have actually, some of them have been hit multiple times. So I understand that we're up to close to like 80 now.
So you got a 2-pound, 3-pound weight coming at you and hit you at 30 miles an hour on the side of the head. Not expecting those, razor sharp claws.
He was big. It could have been much worse. It could have been much worse. The attacks prompted one woman to put up signs warning her neighbors.
It left him with 3 bloody puncture wounds on his scalp.
He flew over me, went up into a tree.
Through this story, I've learned of over 15 attacks from owls on people, and it's not just in one area, but all over Metro Atlanta.
And I wasn't sure if it was a person or what exactly was going on. The owl was chasing me and dive bombing me as I was running back to the house.
They were attacked at night and didn't hear a thing, and that's because owls, when they hunt at night, they are silent flyers, so they can sneak up on their prey.
In addition to numerous recorded swoopings, owls have, on occasion, been documented as remarkably persistent in their attacks on people. They'll quite literally go for the jugular should they perceive you as enough of a threat. They're surprisingly resourceful and bold creatures as well. Several confirmed instances have seen owls launch attacks on people from the outside in, swooping into houses and sometimes even moving cars that contain someone they perceive as being up to no good. So it's fair enough to say that if you're not careful and leave your windows open too late, an owl could well kill you and your entire family tonight. The good news, however, is that such a happening is still, statistically speaking, extremely unlikely. Because in all of recorded human history, we know of only one fatal, presumed owl attack. It concerned a Californian trucker named Robert Schmidt, who was found dead and horribly mauled by the side of the road one morning in 1985, his big rig parked nearby. The poor man had clearly been viciously gouged in the face and chest by talons. A pronounced dent in the hood of his truck led to the conclusion that upon colliding with an owl, Schmidt had pulled over to check on the animal's welfare, at which point the owl launched its fatal attack before flying away. A merciless creature indeed. All of this speaks to the third and final foundational question. Can owls kill people? Well, yes, they can, but because it is so markedly rare that they actually do, it's not the sort of hypothesis you'd want to be pinning all your hopes on when searching for alternative explanations to fight a murder charge. Beggars can't be choosers though, and with Michael shit out of luck after trying to argue Kathleen died in a fall, it was time to start thinking outside the box. Though it wasn't actually Michael and his legal team who were responsible for doing that thinking. The theory originated with a neighbour of Michael's, a man by the name of Larry Pollard, himself a lawyer, but more importantly in this instance, an avid nature enthusiast. Larry first approached David Rudolph with his hypothesis the day before closing arguments, which is one good reason it was never floated in court. Last-minute blowpoke reveals are one thing, but even a notably theatrical attorney has his limits. Now Larry's theory certainly does sound crazy on its face, but once you're filled in on the finer points of it, well, it's still pretty crazy, but at least considerably less so. The first of those finer points worth bearing in mind is that the theory is not so much that an owl killed Kathleen per se, it is that an owl inflicted the initial injuries that precipitated her death. You'll also be relieved to know the theory does not posit a winged assassin swooped through a window to attack Kathleen in her home. Rather, Pollard theorized her ordeal began outside with the owl before continuing in without it. The first piece of evidence for this were a pair of white decorative reindeer placed out front at the Peterson residence. As a neighbour, Larry hadn't observed these previous to the night of Kathleen's death, so the idea goes that as she was preparing to retire for the night, Kathleen may have made the last-minute decision to place the deer outside, and while she was doing so, the owl swooped down, perceiving Kathleen as a threat after the large bright white ornament caught its eye. So far so speculative, but it's once we get to the theorized attack that things start to get interesting. Two wounds placed closely together toward the upper right of Kathleen's scalp were particularly peculiar in their shape, forming a trident pattern. Precisely what kind of impact from what sort of object could be reliably anticipated to create such a pattern had always been a bit of a problem for both the prosecution and the defense. Owl theorists, on the other hand, have no need to hand-wave at some hows when it comes to this piece of evidence. Multiple ornithologists have attested over the years that should a raptor bury its talons in a person's head, it is precisely the sort of trident shape you would anticipate them to leave behind. Beyond shape, the overall nature of the injuries is also consistent. People who have been struck in the head by an owl have described the experience as feeling like being hit by a baseball bat. But while the sudden, forceful impact of an owl can often knock a person off their feet, their relatively light weight means serious internal head trauma is far from a given. In other words, deep lacerations going all the way to the skull, no skull fracture, no brain bruising, no problem. As for the other V-shaped pattern of gashes to the left of Kathleen's head, they would have come from a separate clawing attack, either after or more likely before the owl clamped down on the upper right. The smaller lacerations toward the base of the skull may or may not be attributed to the owl. At some point, of course, Kathleen would have made a dash to the relative safety of her house, and it was perhaps at this point, scared by the approaching unfamiliar territory, that the owl released its talons and flew away. The sequence of events going from the outside in has some support in the drops of blood leading from the pathway up to the entrance. A shocked, stumbling Kathleen would have had blood all over her hands from grasping at the owl, giving further explanation to the blood smeared on the doorframe and on the door itself, which paramedics attested to being wide open upon their arrival, though why the blood was on the inside of the door is still curious. The prosecution had theorized the blood drops on the pathway came from when Michael ran out to the wooded area of the property to dispose of the murder weapon, whatever that was. The defense, quite lamely, suggested that he may have deposited them when going out to the driveway to see if the first responders were pulling up yet, something Michael's never actually claimed to have done. As to why he would have mashed his bloody hand on the door, it's yet another detail in the case neither side had much incentive to spend a lot of time on. It's once Kathleen gets inside the house that things become more difficult, though perhaps not impossible for our theorists to explain. When it came to how she wound up the way she ultimately was, Larry Pollard essentially defaulted back to some version of the defense's fall theory. Kathleen tried to run upstairs, perhaps seeking the upstairs bathroom, but she tripped and fell, further injuring herself. She struggled and stumbled around at the bottom of the steps, bloodying up the north wall in the process, and eventually succumbed to blood loss. Naturally, that explanation carries a lot of the problems we've already been over when criticising the fall theory, but significantly less so because the most severe head injuries were already present before she got to the stairwell. All of the cuts and scrapes across her arms reminiscent of defence injuries could well also have come from attempts to fend off the owl attack outside. And if the owl at some point had gone for her neck, as birds of prey often do, its talons would certainly be capable of fracturing the thyroid cartilage. Further support for the notion of a tussle with a bird was found in Kathleen's autopsy. She had clumps of her own hair glued on her hands in blood, 38 hairs in her left hand and 25 in her right, seemingly pulled out from the root. On the back of her right hand were also 2 pine needles, lending further support to activity from outside. How or why Kathleen would have come to pull her own hair out in the aftermath of a horrible fall or during the course of a brutal bludgeoning seems to defy explanation. If she was desperately trying to pull an owl from her scalp, the presence of all those hairs would make a lot more sense, as would the feathers attached to them, of which there were 2. Microscopic in size, visible only under 400 times magnification, the 2 feather fragments were found attached to one of the very hairs Kathleen seemed to have pulled from her head, glued there by her dried blood. The thing is though, this bombshell has a way of raising as many questions as it claims to answer. If Kathleen did indeed struggle with an owl, in an attack as severe as Larry Pollard's theory submits, would there not be a lot more and a lot bigger feathers to be found than these 2 microscopic ones? Matted in her hair, stuck to her clothing, and strewn through the hallway, even if the bird itself wasn't actually in the house. Here's where the plot thickens, if you can possibly believe that by this point. The owl theory has evolved, or devolved depending on how you look at it, since Larry founded it all those years ago. In 2023, a case researcher named Tiddy Smith published a book titled Death by Talons, which supported much of Larry's theory, but also proposed some big amendments to it, the biggest of which Larry has actually now endorsed. Chiefly among them, the bird was in the house. Now obviously this claim only raises the demand for feathers exponentially, and we'll get to that part. But first, why does Tiddy Smith think the bird was in the house? Well, the thing is, if you really want the owl theory to have any chance of explaining the crime scene in its totality, the bird sort of has to be in the house. This brings us back, yet again, to the north wall of the stairwell, which, as already noted, remained problematic in Larry's original version. It improved upon the original fall theory by way of placing the gashes in Kathleen's head from the outset. But why she would want to be dealing with stairs in that state, rather than opting for a downstairs bathroom, and how exactly she came to be stumbling around and thrashing against the wall are both nearly inexplicable. If a raptor were attached to her head, those two questions are quite easily resolved. The bottom of the stairwell is just where she wound up landing in the unimaginable chaos of it all, and the stumbling and thrashing against the wall would only be expected in the unimaginable chaos of it all. The extremely outlandish scenario could also potentially explain the sort of blood patterns we see. As noted earlier, the blood immediately above the skirting board is remarkably dense, high, and wide. There is also smearing in the blood, which would be consistent with a bloodied Kathleen's body rubbing up against the wall. More important to the bird inside the house theory, though, is the much thinner pattern of blood you can observe spraying outward above this dense area of staining. The blood that was pouring down from Kathleen's head and that which had already accumulated on her clothing would paint the denser area which was unobstructed. The section of wall directly behind her head would have been blocked by the owl, but its beating wings still would have collected blood and dispersed it outward in broad, thin spatter. Remember, in excess of 10,000 individual spatters, a volume that seemed incompatible with a maximum of 10 strikes to the head, but would seem perfectly compatible with the rapidly beating wings of a bird, should you be willing to go there. For further evidence of a bird in the stairwell, Tiddy Smith points to what he sees as droppings on the steps. That's right, bird poo. There are several small, white, circular splats observable in crime scene photos, most notably on the very bottom step of the staircase, the very same step Kathleen's head was resting on. For what it's worth, Smith has had several ornithologists attest that they fit the bill as bird droppings based on appearance. This splat in particular is very clearly deposited on top of Kathleen's blood, meaning it would have wound up there either during or after her death. Though it can't be proven either way if the white splats are bird droppings, as they were never tested, they did come up briefly at trial.
Mr. Harden talked to you about luminol spraying and where it was sprayed. And I think you said inside the stairway it was sprayed on the very top but not on the bottom?
Starting from step number 6 going up, yes, sir.
All right. And when you spray luminol and it dries, it leaves a sort of whitish film, doesn't it?
Yes, sir, it does.
Okay. You recognize what that is?
Yes, sir, that's residue from luminol.
Okay, and does that appear to you to be the residue from the luminol testing that was done that night?
It certainly appears so, yes, sir.
Okay, let me show you Exhibit 147. Do you recognize what that's a picture of?
That's over the lower steps.
And do you see the luminol residue down there?
I see a staining down there, yes, sir. But I also don't see a date on the picture.
My question was, do you see luminol residue just like in 146?
Oh, yes, sir, I do see that.
And again, the area we're talking about specifically is this area right in here, correct?
Yes, sir.
And even over here appears to be some luminol residue, correct?
Yes, sir, it is. I can't testify that that would be photographs that we took.
I understand.
Because we made a point one day last week to look at the date that was on the bottom of the photograph, so I really can't honestly testify that this was a picture that we took.
I understand.
So the defense thought the best candidate for the white circular splats was luminol, presumably left by testing undisclosed by the state, who had previously claimed not to have done any testing on the lower steps. But the state was having none of it.
You've indicated that neither you and Mr. Campen or anybody else that was processing that scene put luminol on that stairway. Is that your testimony?
That's correct.
Do you have any idea who put luminol in this stairway, if that's what it is?
No, sir. Because with the amount of, if that had been, luminol had been sprayed there, when we were in there investigating, that would have been tracked off, but that hasn't even been tracked off.
So anybody could have done that?
Yes, sir.
Are you aware that Mr. Peterson has hired numerous experts to look at this stairway?
I wasn't aware of it, no, sir.
If he had, could they have put luminol in the stairway?
To that as an outrageous allegation. Mr. Revolt.
So if it was luminol, neither side wanted to take credit for it. And in any event, luminol testing involved spraying an even layer of the substance. It would be a clumsy forensic tech indeed who opted to apply it in dispersed individual blots. And the patchy luminol theory wasn't the only weird part of the trial concerning things found on those steps. A very small chip of something from a foreign source was extracted from one of them. That chip of something was under a small clot of Kathleen's blood. Investigators, very understandably, thought it may have been a shard from the murder weapon. The tiny potential piece of murder weapon was catalogued as State's Exhibit 12 and very carefully stored in a container not to be opened before its presentation at trial.
That'll be 12A and what is marked for the record as State's Exhibit 12.
After being handed a pocket knife by prosecutor Jim Harden, evidence technician Eric Campen struggled with the multiple layers of duct tape, almost as if to demonstrate how thoroughly this potentially key piece of evidence had been secured. And after he was at long last able to open the container,
Was that what was the fleck was contained in what's marked as State's Exhibit 12?
Yes, there was a fleck or a small round piece of either metal or wood. I'm not sure what it was. It was silver in color that was placed in this container, and it was sent to the state lab for analysis. And it is not, as you can see, it is not in this container. So with it sealed up, I have no idea where it is.
Okay.
Well, that sucks. While there's still no word on how exactly the shard miraculously vanished from its impeccably secured container, it still lives on in the memories of investigators from the time. As recently as 2018, ID Tech Dan George described it as being a curved shape, quote, almost like a mini talon. Now, if a piece of actual honest-to-God talon were found embedded in one of the steps, that could really blow the case wide open. So all the more a shame that it went missing. And what is all this getting at exactly?
This is a conspiracy. That's what this is. One big damn conspiracy! And everyone's in on it!
Pretty much. Though if it is a conspiracy, not everyone can be in on it in the same way. Neither Jim Harden nor Eric Campen looked all too pleased by the vanishing could-be talon, and it's unlikely they'd sign on to any plan that involved them being made to look like fools in court. Could someone, somewhere behind the scenes, have known more than their foot soldiers, and intercepted the evidence before its appearance in court, wagering a short episode of embarrassment was preferable to the talon chip seeing the light of day? Questions like this demonstrate a fascinating dynamic to the owl theory, where as you follow it, it starts out sounding crazy, then slowly gets progressively more plausible before it begins to start sounding crazy again, but with enough supporting evidence to still warrant consideration. And then as you make certain considerations and follow them through to their logical conclusions, it ramps up to being far crazier than it even sounded to begin with. And on that, it's a good time to return to the question of feathers. Tiddy Smith claims they were there. Hundreds of them. They were, however, obscured by a variety of factors such as grainy footage, low light, and even post-production tricks, such as putting a red filter over the crime scene video to further obscure what little was visible in the original footage. That's all in addition to other cleanup efforts at the scene. Although this already sounds out there, it has to be said that the notion of mass-scale feather suppression is one that only gets increasingly wild the more you consider its implications. Of course, the presence of hundreds of feathers would be visible not only to investigators and medical personnel, but indeed everyone who was on scene that night. Michael Peterson has gone on record to say he saw no feathers. Todd Peterson has never said he saw any. Neither have his 3 friends who were in the house that night. So when we say this would be a conspiracy that everyone is in on, everyone means everyone, including the guy who's facing life in prison. The very same who apparently said he went out to turn off the lights, came back and found Kathleen like that, before telling a story about lounging by the pool for 45 minutes plus. Whatever happened that night, it would seem Michael knows something about it that he wants to hide. So what could have happened to Kathleen involving a bird that both Michael and the cops want to hide? A wife is found splayed out, dead on the floor, with enough blood around her to make it look like a small bomb went off. And her husband is standing there saying, in so many words, she fell down some stairs. It really did have all the hallmarks of a case that had absolutely no business being complicated. Yet the longer you think about it, the more liable you are to wind up asking questions like what could have happened to Kathleen involving a bird that both Michael and the cops want to hide. Perhaps it never really was complicated, and it's just an example of how a handful of anomalies and strange appearances can spin us all totally out of control in a fruitless quest to figure out precisely how a very uncomplicated thing came to be the way it was. If you are still left with doubts, the good news is you don't need to worry about a potentially innocent man languishing in prison. Michael got out years ago. Not because of any miraculous owl discoveries, and in fact not because of any positive evidence of Michael's actual innocence at all. In 2010, it came to light that one of the prosecution's key expert witnesses, a man named Duane Deaver, who spent literally days on the stand bolstering the state's blood evidence, was essentially a fraud. He was found to have reverse engineered his analysis in multiple cases to get results that aligned with the state's theory, leading to scores of unsound convictions. The revelation sent shockwaves through North Carolina, and Deaver's lab was even raided in the middle of testing by a full squad of cops who barged in with guns drawn and commanded all the corrupt scientists to drop to the ground before they convicted another innocent person.
What's going on? All you need, sir. All you need. All you need. All you need.
Or maybe that last detail was just dramatic license on HBO's part, but Duane Deaver was definitely fired. And it was decided that multiple convictions he was a part of had to be overturned. One of those was Michael Peterson's. That's not the same as an exoneration, of course, and for a while it was looking like things were headed to a new trial. But ultimately, Michael and the state were able to negotiate an Alford plea, a deal that's typically struck when both sides feel like they have too much to lose. Michael was able to still openly assert his innocence while formally pleading guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter, with an acknowledgement that a reasonable jury could convict him should his case go back to trial again. The 8 years he spent in prison before his conviction was quashed was then treated as time served. And while it is frustrating and sad to consider the real possibility that an innocent woman's murderer skated by on a technicality, at least you can comfort yourself with the thought that maybe an owl did it.